The fluorescent lights in the emergency ward hummed low, a steady electric buzz that mixed with the frantic shouts of nurses. Paramedics burst through the double doors, pushing a stretcher where a man lay thrashing, his skin mottled with purple patches that looked more like week-old bruises than something fresh. The smell hit first, so thick, so foul, that staff pulled their masks tighter against their faces. One orderly gagged and turned away. Another muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ, he smells like he's been dead for days." But the man on the stretcher was very much alive, wide-eyed, fighting for every ragged breath. His name was Marcus Johnson, 36 years old, a truck driver who had spent most of his adult life hauling cargo across state lines, living on diner food and cheap motel beds. Tonight, though, he wasn't on the road. Tonight, he was the patient doctors whispered about as they scrambled to hook him up to IVs, cut away his shirt, and assess the damage spreading across his body. The ER attending lifted Marcus's arm and recoiled. The skin was hot, swollen, already peeling in places, as if something inside him was trying to push its way out. The odor of decay hung in the air, impossible to ignore. "Get blood cultures stat," the doctor barked. "He's septic. I've never seen it move this fast." Marcus tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. He coughed, flecks of blood staining his lips, eyes darting in panic as if begging someone to understand. He hadn't been in a car crash. He hadn't been shot or stabbed. What brought him here was stranger than anything the ER had prepared for. By the time the monitors beeped in rhythm with his failing pulse, one truth was clear. Marcus's body was rotting while he was still alive. Staff wheeled him down the corridor, past the wide-eyed stares of patients in the waiting room. A mother pulled her child closer. Someone whispered, "Is he contagious?" Nobody had an answer. For all the doctors knew, they were watching the beginning of an outbreak, something no textbook had ever described. The infection wasn't creeping in days or weeks. It was racing hour by hour, minute by minute. Later, when word of this night spread across Atlanta, people would remember the details differently. Some swore they heard the scream Marcus let out when his fingernails began to darken and detach. Others said they'd never forget the way his skin bubbled and split, like meat left too long under the sun. But everyone remembered the smell, the metallic rot that clung to the air vents, lingering long after Marcus was stabilized behind sealed doors. Detectives would arrive soon after, summoned not just because a man was dying, but because of the way it started. Witnesses from a cheap roadside motel had told 911 dispatchers about a guest who collapsed in the lobby, reeking of decay, after spending the night with a woman no one could quite describe. Tall, they said, unnaturally thin, a figure you couldn't look at without shivering. By morning, she was gone, leaving behind only sheets stained with foul-smelling fluid and a man whose body was falling apart from the inside. In the controlled chaos of the ER, no one had time to dwell on legends or rumors. Doctors fought to save what was left of Marcus. Nurses charted his vitals, their hands shaking as they noted the rapid spread of tissue death along his torso. The attending pressed a gloved hand against Marcus's chest and whispered to himself, "This isn't medicine. This is something else." And yet, beyond the walls of the hospital, whispers were already starting. Whispers about the woman in the motel, about Atlanta's old stories, urban legends passed from barstool to barstool, about a skeletal bride who brought death to any man who lay with her. That night, as machines beeped and Marcus hovered between life and death, two questions echoed louder than the alarms in the ER. Who was the woman that vanished before dawn? And what had she left inside Marcus Johnson that was tearing him apart so fast? Marcus Johnson was the kind of man you might pass on the street without a second glance. 36 years old, 6 feet tall, lean from years of long-haul trucking, he carried himself with the quiet weariness of someone who had spent more time on interstates than in living rooms. His life revolved around miles of asphalt, the rumble of 18 wheels beneath him, and the endless loop of truck stops, diners, and motels that blurred together across state lines. To the people who knew him in Atlanta, Marcus was dependable, hard-working, and, perhaps most of all, lonely. He lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the city's south side, a place that smelled faintly of motor oil and reheated takeout. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of his late father, a man who had also worked the roads. Marcus never married, though there were a few girlfriends in his 20s who hoped he'd settle down. He never did. The schedule was too demanding, the paychecks barely enough to cover rent and gas, and the loneliness of the job left him too drained to commit to anything lasting. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. He'd nod in the hallway, maybe exchange a quick, "How you doing?" before disappearing into his apartment. At the corner bar near the truck depot, regulars recalled him nursing cheap whiskey in the back booth, staring at the TV without really watching. "Good guy," one bartender said later, "but you always felt like there was a weight on his shoulders, like he was waiting for something, anything, to shake up his routine." The truth was, Marcus had been carrying more than just cargo. The long nights on the road wore him down. The silence of the cab, broken only by talk radio and static, made him restless. He envied the families he saw through glowing windows as he passed neighborhoods at midnight, children laughing at the dinner table, couples fighting or embracing on porches. He told a coworker once, "I live everywhere and nowhere at the same time." Money wasn't good either. Trucking had changed. Pay was lower, routes longer, and the new generation of drivers didn't last. Marcus stuck with it because it was all he knew, but the strain showed. His mother, who lived 3 hours away in Macon, worried about him. She'd call and ask when he was going to find someone, settle down, maybe even start a family. He always laughed it off, saying, "I'm married to the road." But late at night, when the engine was the only sound, he admitted to himself how much he hated the emptiness. That weekend in Atlanta, he wasn't supposed to be working. He had 3 days off before his next run to Texas. He planned to do laundry, maybe catch up on sleep, maybe even call an old friend he hadn't spoken to in months. But on Saturday night, boredom pushed him out of his apartment and into the glow of a neon sign just a few blocks from the highway, a dive bar where truckers, drifters, and lonely souls gathered to drink away hours they couldn't fill otherwise. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and cheap perfume. Marcus ordered a drink, the same whiskey he always did, and sat alone at the end of the counter. He wasn't expecting company, wasn't looking for anything. But sometimes fate doesn't ask what you want, it just delivers. That was the night he first saw her. Later, when detectives pieced together the events of that weekend, friends and fellow drivers struggled to make sense of it. To them, Marcus was a decent guy. Flawed, maybe a little lost, but not reckless. He wasn't the type to chase after strange women in dark corners of Atlanta. He wasn't the type to step willingly into danger. And yet, something about that night would pull him off his usual path. Something, or someone, was waiting for him in that bar. What no one knew then, as Marcus sat with his drink in hand, was that this ordinary man, with his ordinary life, was about to walk straight into the kind of nightmare that would make headlines across the city. His craving for connection, just one night of not feeling alone, would lead him into the arms of a woman unlike anyone he, or anyone else in Atlanta, had ever seen before. The bar on the south side of Atlanta was nothing special, just another dive tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat, its neon sign buzzing with half-dead letters. Inside, the place smelled of stale beer and cigarettes, a haze of smoke clinging to the low ceiling. A jukebox hummed an old blues track in the corner, drowned out by the occasional crack of pool balls from the back. It was the kind of joint where people came to disappear, where faces blurred together after enough cheap whiskey. Marcus Johnson sat at the far end of the counter, his usual spot, shoulders slouched and eyes fixed on the amber swirl in his glass. He wasn't reckless, but loneliness made him vulnerable, easy prey for what came next. But then she walked in. At first, Marcus thought maybe his tired eyes were playing tricks on him. The figure by the doorway looked wrong somehow, too tall and too fragile at the same time. She stood nearly 6 feet, long dark hair spilling over her shoulders, but what caught everyone's attention was her frame. She couldn't have weighed more than 88 pounds, her limbs impossibly thin, her cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. Against the dim bar light, her skin seemed translucent, almost gray. A couple of regulars stopped mid-conversation to stare. One man muttered, "Damn, she looks like a ghost," before shaking his head and turning back to his beer. She didn't flinch at the stares. She moved slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus. There was something in that look, hungry, focused, as if she'd been searching for him specifically. She slid onto the stool beside him, her presence sending a chill through the air that made Marcus straighten in his seat. "You look lonely," she said, her voice low, almost musical, but with a rasp that hinted at cigarettes or something older, deeper. Marcus blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't the type women approached, not like this. "I guess you could say that," he muttered, his throat dry. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Up close, she was even more unsettling. Her collarbones jutted out sharply, her hands pale and bony, nails painted a chipped black. Yet there was something magnetic about her, something that made Marcus unable to look away. He noticed her eyes were a strange shade, dark, but with flecks of gold that seemed to shimmer under the bar's neon light. "Buy me a drink?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, strands of hair falling across her face. Marcus nodded to the bartender, who raised an eyebrow but poured her a glass of vodka without a word. She sipped it slowly, her lips barely touching the rim, as though the act of drinking was more for show than need. As the minutes ticked by, conversation flowed, though Marcus would later struggle to remember what exactly they talked about. He recalled her name, Elena. He recalled the way she leaned in close, her breath cold against his ear, telling him she had just come back to Atlanta after a long time away. Every word she spoke felt rehearsed, like lines from a play. And every time she touched his arm lightly, he felt a shiver run deep into his bones. Other patrons noticed. The bartender would later tell detectives, "She gave me the creeps. Not just skinny, wrong. Like she didn't belong here." But in the moment, Marcus was transfixed. Whether it was loneliness, curiosity, or something more primal, he couldn't pull himself away. At one point, Elena laughed softly at something he said. The sound was hollow, empty, but Marcus found himself smiling anyway. He realized he was leaning closer. A sharp, sour odor clung to her skin, unsettling and strange. He should have pulled back. He didn't. "Let's go somewhere," she whispered, her hand brushing his. Her fingers were ice cold. Marcus hesitated only a moment before nodding. Together, they left the bar. No one tried to stop them, though several sets of eyes followed as the pair stepped into the damp Atlanta night. Outside, the rain had turned to mist, coating the cracked pavement in a ghostly sheen. Later, witnesses would struggle to describe what they saw. Some said she moved like smoke, gliding more than walking. Others swore she didn't cast a shadow under the flickering streetlight. But Marcus, blinded by need and the strange pull of her presence, didn't notice any of it. They walked side by side toward a cheap roadside motel, the kind Marcus had stayed in countless times during his trucking runs. As they passed beneath the neon vacancy sign, he glanced at her once more. For the briefest second, under the sickly red glow, her face looked skeletal, her eyes hollow. He blinked, and it was gone, just Elena again, thin, strange, but undeniably real. By the time the motel clerk handed over the key, Marcus had convinced himself he'd imagined it. He told himself she was just a woman, odd and frail, but flesh and blood like anyone else. He didn't know yet that this night would be the last time anyone saw Elena Reyes alive, or whatever she really was. The motel room was exactly what you'd expect for $40 a night. Peeling wallpaper, a buzzing fluorescent light over the sink, and a comforter patterned in faded blues and browns that looked like it hadn't been washed since the Clinton administration. The air smelled of mildew and cleaning chemicals that never quite did their job. Marcus had stayed in 100 places like this during his trucking runs, but tonight the familiar squalor felt different, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elena closed the door behind them with a soft click, setting the chain lock with deliberate care. She moved slowly, her limbs sharp and deliberate, like a marionette being guided by unseen strings. Marcus tried to shake the unease that crept over him. He told himself this was what he wanted: distraction, escape, maybe even a story to laugh about later. Still, something about the way her shadow, stretched long and crooked under the dim lamp, made the hairs on his neck rise. She turned toward him and smiled, if you could call it that. Her lips curled upward, but her eyes didn't change. They stayed cold, flat, unreadable. She slipped off her coat, revealing a body so impossibly thin that Marcus felt a stab of guilt mixed with desire. Her dress clung to her bones, fabric hanging loose where curves should have been. Her ribs showed through like piano keys on her pale skin. "You're staring," she said softly, her voice low, teasing. Sorry. You're just different," Marcus stammered, heat rising to his face. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his chest. Her touch was startling, ice cold, the kind of chill that seemed to seep past his skin and settle into his blood. But when she leaned in, her lips brushing his neck, the shock gave way to hunger. He wanted to forget himself, forget the emptiness of his apartment and the miles of highway waiting for him next week. For once, he wanted to feel alive. Their kiss was strange. Her mouth tasted faintly metallic, sharp like biting down on a coin. He thought of blood, though there was no wound. Her skin carried the same scent, a faint iron tang that clung to the sheets when she pressed him back onto the bed. He told himself it was perfume, or maybe just the smell of the cheap fabric. But somewhere deep down, the animal part of his brain recoiled. The intimacy itself was hurried, almost mechanical. Elena moved without warmth, without passion, as though following a script she'd performed countless times before. Marcus tried to lose himself in the moment, but he couldn't ignore the way her bones pressed into him, how her breath rattled faintly in her chest, or how her eyes never fully closed. At one point, when he glanced up, he swore her pupils dilated so wide that her eyes turned black entirely. He blinked, and they were normal again, or as normal as they could be. Afterward, Marcus lay on his back, chest heaving, sweat beading across his skin. Elena sat upright at the edge of the bed, staring out the window into the night. She didn't speak. She didn't even seem to breathe. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioner struggling against the Georgia humidity. Then the nausea hit. At first, Marcus thought it was the whiskey from earlier, his stomach twisting into knots. He sat up quickly, pressing a hand to his gut. But the pain sharpened, stabbing deeper, spreading upward into his chest. He stumbled into the bathroom, collapsing in front of the sink as bile burned his throat. He retched violently, his reflection swimming in the cracked mirror. His skin looked pale, almost gray under the fluorescent light, sweat dripping in thick rivulets down his temples. When he wiped his mouth and looked again, he froze. There, along the side of his neck, a faint purple blotch had appeared. It looked like a bruise, but it pulsed faintly, as though alive. "Elena," he croaked, his voice raw. She didn't answer. When he staggered back into the room, she was still sitting at the window, her profile outlined against the flickering neon sign outside. She didn't turn, didn't move. For a moment, Marcus thought she hadn't even noticed his collapse. "I don't feel good," he muttered, gripping the wall for support. His chest ached, his vision blurred. The blotch on his neck had spread, darkening into an ugly shade of black. Finally, she turned. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes, those strange, gold-flecked eyes, locked onto his with a calmness that chilled him. "Rest," she said simply. "It will pass." But Marcus knew, in the pit of his stomach, that it wasn't going to pass. He crawled back onto the bed, clutching himself, shivering despite the heavy Georgia heat. The sheets smelled stronger now, metallic, sour, rotten. He tried to ask her who she really was, what was happening to him, but his tongue felt thick, useless. Darkness edged at his vision. The last thing he remembered before slipping into a restless half-sleep was Elena's silhouette by the window. She stood perfectly still, watching the horizon as if waiting for something or someone. In the grainy glow of the motel's neon, her body seemed to flicker, her outline blurring like smoke caught in a draft. By dawn, Marcus would wake to a nightmare far worse than nausea. And Elena would be gone. The first thing Marcus noticed when his eyes cracked open was the smell. Not the usual musty motel odor of cigarette smoke and damp carpet, This was sharper, heavier, a stench that clung to the back of his throat and made his stomach roll. He tried to sit up, but his body felt weighted, sluggish, like every muscle had turned to stone overnight. A shaft of weak sunlight cut through the cheap curtains, and when it hit his skin, he froze. Purple-black blotches covered his arms, spreading like ink under paper. The skin around them looked loose, sagging, and when he pressed a trembling finger against one, it gave beneath the touch as though something inside was hollowing out his flesh. His breath came in ragged gasps, and each inhale carried the faintest whiff of rot. Elena, his voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The room was silent. The chair by the window where she had sat for hours was empty. The chain lock was still latched. No sound of running water, no creak of footsteps. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Marcus swung his legs off the bed, but when his feet hit the floor, pain shot up his calves. He looked down and saw dark streaks snaking along his ankles, the skin swollen, blistered. He stumbled, crashing against the nightstand. The lamp toppled and shattered, throwing the room into fractured light. By now, the smell was unbearable. It wasn't just the room, it was him. The stench was seeping from his own pores. He gagged, covering his mouth, but the sour, metallic odor filled his nostrils. He staggered toward the door, desperate for air, desperate for someone to help. When he pulled it open and stumbled into the hallway, the reaction was immediate. A housekeeper pushing a cart down the corridor stopped dead, her eyes going wide. She clamped a hand over her mouth and dropped a stack of towels to the floor. "Señor, Dios mío," she gasped before spinning and sprinting toward the lobby. Marcus barely made it 3 steps before his legs buckled. He fell hard to his knees, palms slapping against the stained carpet. The sound of his labored breathing echoed down the hallway, each gasp rattling like broken glass in his lungs. He crawled forward, dragging himself toward the faint glow of the exit sign. By the time he collapsed in the motel lobby, the scene had turned into chaos. The clerk behind the counter recoiled so violently he knocked over his coffee mug. Guests waiting to check out whispered, covered their noses, pulled their children close. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Someone else gagged and hurried outside, unable to bear the stench. Marcus tried to speak, but what came out was a hoarse groan, followed by a wet cough that sprayed flecks of blood onto the tiled floor. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked through with sweat, and beneath the fabric the dark blotches had grown, spreading up his neck, swallowing his collarbone. When paramedics burst through the doors minutes later, their expressions told the story. Shock, confusion, disgust. One of them muttered, "What the hell?" before snapping on gloves. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me." Another barked, kneeling at Marcus's side. But Marcus's vision was swimming. The lobby ceiling bent and twisted above him, lights blurring into halos. He felt himself lifted, strapped onto a gurney, the straps biting into his blistered skin. As they wheeled him out, the morning air hit his face, cool and sharp, but it didn't mask the smell rolling off him. Neighbors stood in their doorways, covering their mouths, staring as though they were watching a dead man rise. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked frantically. One checked his pulse and shook his head. "It's dropping fast." Another started in 4, wincing at the way Marcus's skin tore beneath the needle, leaking more than blood. It looked like tissue breaking apart. "Get him to Grady now," the lead medic shouted to the driver. The sirens wailed as the ambulance tore through Atlanta streets, but inside the cabin the noise was drowned by the beeping of monitors and the sickening smell of decay. Marcus's eyes fluttered open briefly, catching the medic's grim expression. He wanted to ask about Elena, to explain what happened, but the words stuck in his throat. All that escaped was a faint whisper, "Help me." At Grady Memorial Hospital, the emergency doors flew open. Doctors and nurses rushed him inside, recoiling as the stretcher rolled past. A nurse gagged audibly and turned away. Another whispered, "He smells like he's been dead a week." The attending physician barked orders, blood cultures, tissue samples, a full-body scan. But even as they worked, it was obvious they were witnessing something they couldn't explain. The necrosis wasn't creeping, It was racing, swallowing his body faster than any known infection. Skin bubbled and split under the heat of the overhead lights. Machines beeped in frantic rhythm, alarms shrieking as Marcus's blood pressure plummeted. Doctors fought to stabilize him, but beneath the medical urgency lurked another fear. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Was it contagious? Was this man carrying something that could spread beyond these walls? Staff whispered behind masks, their gloved hands trembling as they tried to contain the uncontainable. Outside, word spread quickly. Paramedics whispered to nurses. Nurses whispered to orderlies. And soon the story reached waiting rooms and cell phones. A man found rotting alive in a motel. By noon, the police had been notified. Detectives were on their way. And while Marcus clung to life under fluorescent lights, one question burned through the minds of everyone who saw him that morning. What had happened in that motel room? And where was the woman who brought him there? Detective Carla Hughes had seen her share of strange cases in Atlanta. Gang shootings, drug houses gone bad, even the occasional cult ritual out in the suburbs. But nothing prepared her for the motel on Old National Highway that Sunday morning. The moment she stepped through the door of room 27, the smell hit like a wall. It wasn't just mildew or body odor. It was the heavy, metallic stench of rot, a smell that lingered in her nostrils long after she tugged her sleeve across her face. The room looked abandoned in a hurry. Sheets tangled, the comforter bunched in a heap at the foot of the bed. Patches of dark fluid stained the mattress, seeping through to the frame. A cracked bedside lamp flickered, casting jagged shadows across peeling wallpaper. Carla's partner, Detective Lewis, bent down with gloved hands and grimaced. "Smells like something died in here," he muttered. "Something's dying," Carla corrected, thinking of Marcus Johnson strapped to a hospital bed just miles away, his body decaying while machines fought to keep him alive. The motel clerk confirmed Marcus had checked in just after midnight, with a woman. Tall, rail-thin, long dark hair. No ID, no card on file. She paid cash. The clerk remembered because she wouldn't look him in the eye, and because her voice gave him the chills. He watched them walk into room 27 and never saw her leave. The security cameras backed him up. Footage showed Marcus entering with a woman around 12:14 a.m. But from then until morning, the hallway feed showed no one leaving. At 6:07 a.m., the door opened. Marcus staggered out alone, sick and stumbling. "What about the window?" Carla asked. They checked. The window had been locked from the inside, dust still clinging to the sill. No footprints outside. No forced entry. It was as if the woman simply dissolved into air. Forensics techs swabbed the sheets, scraped the mattress, and bagged samples from the dark patches. When the swabs came back from the lab, the results were baffling. No trace of semen, saliva, or the usual biological markers. Instead, the fabric was saturated with a strange protein compound that resembled decayed tissue, but not Marcus's. Almost like the sheets were sweating rot. The tech explained, uneasily. At Grady Memorial, the doctors were equally mystified. Dr. Elaine Carter, an infectious disease specialist, had never seen necrosis spread so quickly. "It's like necrotizing fasciitis on steroids," she told Carla in the ICU. "But cultures aren't growing the bacteria we'd expect. We're seeing something new, or something very, very old." She showed the detectives tissue slides under the microscope. Cells blackened, collapsing in on themselves. "Whatever this is, it's not behaving like anything in the textbooks." Carla pressed for answers. Was Marcus infected by the woman? Was she carrying something weaponized? Some designer pathogen? Dr. Carter shook her head. "If this is contagious, we'd be seeing it already. None of the staff handling him have symptoms." "No, detective, whatever happened to him, it's personal, intimate. It came from her." That idea unsettled Carla more than she wanted to admit. Because if it wasn't a virus or bacteria they could isolate, what was it? As word of the case spread, so did the whispers. Locals who lived near the motel began talking, lowering their voices when detectives walked by. One housekeeper refused to enter room 27 again, crossing herself and muttering, "La novia de Husos." The bone bride. Carla had heard fragments of the story before, half-jokingly at barbecues or in late-night conversations with patrol officers. An urban legend that stretched back decades. A woman too thin to be alive, haunting bars on the South Side. Men who left with her didn't come back the same, if they came back at all. The legend varied. Sometimes she was a vengeful spirit, sometimes a diseased prostitute, sometimes the ghost of a woman who had wasted away during an epidemic in the 1800s. But the details were consistent. She was tall, she was skeletal, and she left death in her wake. At the station, Carla dug through old case files. To her unease, she found reports that lined up. 1998. A man found dead in his truck, body decomposed beyond recognition, though he'd been alive 2 days earlier. Witnesses said he left a bar with a gaunt woman. 2007. A bartender claimed a skeletal lady lured a regular out the door. He was later hospitalized with rapid tissue death, never recovered. The incidents never made headlines, brushed off as rare infections or drugs gone wrong. But the pattern was there. "Looks like your ghost story's real," Lewis said grimly as they pored over the files. Carla wasn't ready to call it supernatural, but she couldn't deny the evidence was sliding out of the realm of the explainable. Elena, or whatever her name truly was, had left nothing behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, no trace sheet ever existed, except for Marcus's failing body and the foul-smelling stains in that motel room. Back at Grady, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, heavily sedated. When he did speak, his words rattled the nurses. He mumbled about her eyes, black as night one moment, glowing gold the next. About her skin that smelled like iron. About the way she sat by the window, waiting, as if for something unseen. Detective Hughes stood at his bedside, watching the machines beep. She wanted to believe this was just a case of bad luck, a sick woman spreading a lethal infection. But the more she listened, the more the old Atlanta whispers crawled into her thoughts. The Bone Bride. Some said she wasn't alive, not anymore. Some said she fed on men, left them hollowed out, their bodies rotting before their time. As dusk fell over the city, Carla looked at the file spread across her desk and admitted something she'd never said in her career. She wasn't sure this case had a human explanation. And out there, somewhere in Atlanta's neon-lit streets, the woman no camera could capture might already be searching for her next victim. In the days after Marcus Johnson was admitted to Grady Memorial, the case turned into a tug-of-war between science and superstition. On one side, the doctors and pathologists struggled to pin down a rational explanation for what was happening to his body. On the other, Atlanta streets buzzed with whispers of an old legend come alive, the Bone Bride. Dr. Elaine Carter, head of infectious disease at the hospital, was blunt with detectives. "I don't believe in ghosts, but I'll tell you this. What's happening to Marcus shouldn't be possible." She laid out the lab results. No identifiable bacteria growing in cultures, no virus they could isolate. Tissue samples disintegrated faster than they could be preserved, as though whatever was inside him was consuming itself the moment it was exposed to air. "We're seeing necrosis at a speed that defies every rule we know. If it's a pathogen, it's something undocumented, maybe even engineered. But it doesn't fit any known category." The forensic pathologist, Dr. James Holloway, agreed, though reluctantly. A grizzled veteran with 30 years of autopsies behind him, Holloway was not a man easily rattled. Yet when he reviewed the swabs from the motel, his brow furrowed. "This isn't decomposition from outside in," he explained. "It's inside out. His body's behaving like it's been dead for a week, but the organs are still trying to function. I've only seen something close to this once before." He pulled an old file from his archives, a yellowed folder, marked Alabama, 1995. The case involved a man in Birmingham who'd been admitted with similar symptoms. Rapid onset necrosis, skin sloughing off, the same overpowering stench of decay. He died within 48 hours. Witnesses claimed he had spent the night with a tall, skeletal woman who vanished before sunrise. Holloway's report at the time had listed unknown septic event as the cause of death. "I thought it was a fluke," Holloway admitted. "But now I'm not so sure." News of the parallels leaked quickly. Local reporters latched onto the Alabama file, splashing headlines across evening broadcasts. Atlanta man rotting alive. Linked to 1995 Birmingham death? Talk radio shows filled with callers swapping rumors about the woman who rots men. On social media, hashtags like hashtag #BoneBride and hashtag Atlanta Curse trended, with users posting grainy memes of skeletal brides and half-serious warnings. Don't take home strangers from bars. The community was split. Some insisted it had to be medical. Maybe a rare, flesh-eating bacteria. Maybe something new unleashed by climate change or lab leaks. Others, especially older residents, leaned into the legend. They told stories of cousins or neighbors who had vanished after nights out, their names etched only in whispers. One woman at a candlelight vigil outside the hospital swore her uncle died the same way in the late 70s. They called her La Novia de Husos back then too, she said, clutching a rosary. This thing's been here longer than the highways. Detective Carla Hughes found herself caught in the middle. She sat through endless consultations with the medical team, listening to their theories, but when she returned to the neighborhoods around the motel, all she heard was folklore. A barber on Cleveland Avenue told her, every 20 years, she shows up, like clockwork, picks a man, hollows him out, then disappears. A bartender at the dive, where Marcus met Elena, remembered seeing her eyes glint gold. That ain't no infection, he muttered, shaking his head. That's death walking. Meanwhile, Marcus clung to life, his body a battlefield of machines for drips and desperate interventions. Sedated, he drifted between nightmares and lucidity. When awake, he whispered about her, how she sat by the window all night, how her skin felt like ice, how her eyes went black before she disappeared. Nurses noted his words in charts, but privately they swapped nervous glances. He sounds like all the stories, one said. Dr. Carter pushed back against the folklore, even as her own confidence wavered. She presented her findings to a panel of CDC experts who flew in from their Atlanta headquarters. They too were baffled. No contagion spread beyond Marcus. No staff infected, no secondary cases. If this is a pathogen, it's the most selective one we've ever seen, one CDC doctor remarked. That night, after the meeting, Carter sat alone in her office reviewing Holloway's Alabama file. She circled the parallels. Same rapid necrosis, same vanishing woman, same lack of transmission. This isn't science, she muttered, but the truth lingered. Science had no answers. As days passed, the community's fascination curdled into fear. Parents warned sons not to go drinking alone. Taxi drivers told riders about the Bone Bride, as if it were gospel. Local churches held prayer vigils. Pastors thundered about demons in flesh. And in the middle of it all, Marcus lay dying, his body serving as Exhibit A for a debate no one could settle. For Carla, the investigation felt like chasing smoke. She had no fingerprints, no DNA, no face to put on a wanted poster. Just a tall, skeletal silhouette caught briefly on a grainy bar camera. When she replayed the footage, the image seemed to flicker unnaturally, her form blurring at the edges. The tech dismissed it as compression artifact, but Carla wasn't so sure. Science demanded answers. Folklore offered only fear. And somewhere between the two, the truth about Elena, the Bone Bride, remained just out of reach, waiting for her next opportunity to step out of the shadows. Weeks later, Marcus Johnson was still alive, but barely. Against every prediction, the man who had been found rotting alive in that roadside motel managed to survive the infection, though the price was steep. Surgeons had removed large portions of necrotic tissue. His left leg was amputated above the knee, his right arm reduced to scarred muscle and grafted skin. The mirror in his hospital room was covered, at his request. He couldn't bear to see the stranger staring back at him. When detectives visited, Marcus spoke in whispers. His voice was hoarse, his throat raw from weeks of tubes. He didn't ask about the investigation, about whether they'd found her. He already knew the answer. Instead, he repeated the same memory like a prayer. Her eyes at the window, glowing faintly gold against the neon haze. She wasn't real, he rasped, or she was too real. I don't know anymore. Detective Carla Hughes closed her notebook each time, her frustration mounting. There were no leads, no fingerprints, no name in any database. Elena, or whoever she was, left no trace. The footage remained useless. Only Marcus, never her. And yet by dawn, she was gone. The motel, shut down room 27. Staff refused to enter even after the biohazard team scrubbed the place. Guests complained of a lingering smell, like death baked into the walls. Locals drove by just to stare at the boarded-up window, muttering prayers under their breath. In online forums, amateur sleuths dissected every detail, posting side-by-side comparisons of Marcus's case and the old Alabama file from 1995. Threads with titles like "The Bone Bride Strikes Again" filled with speculation. Was she a woman with a weaponized disease? A demon in flesh? Or something caught between the two? Science tried to fight back with logic. Dr. Elaine Carter released a cautious statement, describing Marcus's condition as a novel necrotizing syndrome of unknown origin. She emphasized there was no evidence of contagion, that the public wasn't at risk. But her words did little to calm the city. People didn't believe what they couldn't see, and what they could see, Marcus, alive but ruined, looked like a curse made flesh. Meanwhile, Atlanta's folklore machine spun faster than any lab test. At barber shops and church pews, in late-night diners and crowded buses, the story grew. Men joked nervously about staying home. Women warned friends about strangers at bars. A preacher on local radio thundered about judgment and temptation, calling Elena the devil's bride. Young people made TikToks in which thin, ghostly figures lured men into motels before jump scares cut the screen to black. Hashtags #BoneBride and #RottingCurse climbed into the trending list. For Marcus, the noise meant nothing. He lay in his hospital bed, tubes and wires tethering him to machines, his body a battlefield scarred by something he could never explain. Reporters begged for an interview, but he refused. The man who once lived on the road now stared out a single window, afraid of shadows. His mother visited daily, praying softly at his bedside. Sometimes, Marcus would grab her hand and whisper, "Don't let her in," even when the door was locked and the room secured. Detective Hughes pushed her team to keep digging. They pulled missing persons reports from the past 50 years, looking for a woman matching Elena's description. They cross-referenced bar tabs, motel registries, even combed through folklore archives at Emory University. Nothing stuck. Every thread unraveled. Late at night, Carla sat alone in her office, staring at the grainy bar footage. Elena's silhouette flickered on screen, frozen in the doorway. The more she watched, the less human it looked. By the end of the summer, the case file was marked inactive. Not closed, never closed, but stalled. There was nothing left to chase. No suspect. No explanation. Just Marcus, broken but alive, and a community left to wrestle with its own beliefs. Some clung to science, waiting for researchers to name the disease and explain its origin. Others swore the Bone Bride was real, a curse stalking Atlanta's men every generation. For them, Marcus wasn't just a survivor. He was a warning. Proof that some stories, no matter how unbelievable, carried teeth. On a warm September evening, candles flickered outside Grady Memorial at a vigil organized by locals. Some prayed for Marcus's recovery. Others prayed for protection from the Bone Bride. A woman in the crowd whispered to her friend, "If she's still out there, someone else will meet her. It's only a matter of time." As night fell, the boarded-up motel room on Old National sat in silence, neon lights buzzing faintly over the empty parking lot. Drivers passing by rolled their windows up, as if afraid the smell of death might seep inside. In the shadows of the city, stories grew. Some said she had been spotted again, slipping into another bar, eyes glowing gold. Others claimed she was never gone, that she was everywhere, waiting, choosing. And in the quiet, one truth lingered, heavier than any diagnosis or headline. Elena had never been caught. No one knew what she was. No one knew if she would return. But everyone in Atlanta knew her name now. The Bone Bride. A legend reborn, and perhaps a promise that the nightmare wasn't over.